Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Ismail, and I'm from the communications team at Global School Leaders. We're very excited to welcome you to the third day of our first ever School Leadership Matters Summit. Before we begin, here are a few guidelines to ensure the session runs smoothly. Please select the interpretation option at the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language to follow the discussion seamlessly. This session is available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. On the slide, you'll see instructions on how to enable interpretation settings. This session will last 45 minutes, which includes dedicated time for question and answers at the end of the session. Please use the chat feature to ask questions. The panelists will try and answer as many as possible. You can also use the chat feature to engage with other attendees or share your insights. As attendees, you will remain on mute throughout the session to avoid background noise. And a gentle reminder for you to keep your questions and comments respectful in the chat, ensuring a positive and productive environment. Now that we have that out of the way, hello and welcome all. I'm thrilled to pass it on to Carolina Conto from UNESCO IIEP to kick us off with the spotlight session on advancing women in school leadership. Over to you, Carolina.
Thank you very much, Ismail. So good morning, afternoon, or even to everyone, and thank you for attending this session. So in this session, we are going to discuss the role of women in school leadership, focusing on a joint initiative by the UNESCO International Institute of Education Planning, IIEP, and UNICEF Innocenti's Global Office of Research and Foresight. So this initiative is called Women in Learning Leadership. Sonakshi, my colleague, will be sharing the screen. And my name, as it was said, is Carolina Alban. I am the R&D manager at UNESCO IIEP's Africa office based in Dakar, Senegal. And I'm here today with other IIEP and UNICEF colleagues, as well as a representative from the Ministry of Education of Madagascar, to present some evidence on this subject based on insights that are directly drawn from the WILL initiative. Next slide, please, Sonakshi. Thank you. The first question some of you are probably asking is why women's school leadership is important. We know that effective school leadership plays a key role in enhancing education outcomes and school safety, representing a promising avenue for improving children's life. School leaders can influence the school environment at various levels, from school organization, culture, teachers' motivation, pedagogy, students' well-being, and also the relationship with the community. In this context, there are three broad arguments why it is crucial to invest in women school leaders. The first is equity. We will see that through the presentation, women remain underrepresented in school leadership positions in many countries, and not only in low and middle income countries, despite the fact that women represent half of the population. And having a gender equitable workforce in education and in leadership positions in education allows the education system to benefit from having a better representation of the population and increasing the variety of perspective, experiences, and practices. The second argument is that we have now emerging evidence showing that when women do become school leaders, when they have the opportunity to be trained as school leaders, they are competent and they perform as well as or better than their peers. In fact, a lot of emerging evidence we will be presenting today shows positive association between women-led schools and education outcomes in various countries. And the third and final argument is because exposure to women in leadership positions in general, but also in education, can help combat negative gender stereotypes and initiate role model effects for girls, women, families, and the society. So over the next few slides, as I said before, I will be sharing some evidence to illustrate these 3 points. So the first point is equity. This graph represents the proportion of women in school leadership positions. So you will see in brighter, lighter blue, that percentage and the proportion of women in the teaching force across 10 Sub-Saharan African countries, from Togo to Zambia. So we see here a very clear pattern that these countries have meant, despite enormous efforts for having more women in the teaching force, they have smaller proportions of women teachers, women in leadership positions. So we see this gap between the blue and the green bar, showing that there is still a gap. So we have countries like Zambia, Niger, in which over half of the teaching force is represented by women. But then when it comes to school leaders, we have 17, 20%. So there is a gap for improvement. Next slide, please. So that is for Sub-Saharan Africa. We have several similar analyses showing similar results for other regions. This one is about Southeast Asia. So we have countries like Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Vietnam, that have also made great strides in the representation of women in the teaching profession. But we see very clear that there is still a barrier for them to reach in the school leadership positions. Next slide. So there is hope, because there are regions in the world, and this graph is from Latin America and the Caribbean, where this representation gap between women teachers and women school leaders is much smaller. So this is something that can be seen at the right side of the graph, although there are exceptions which are closer to what we are seeing for Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, like what we see in Colombia, for instance, with over 60%, close to 60% of women teachers in the women teachers, and only 37% of women in school leadership positions. Next slide, please. So I said at the beginning that the relevance of women school leadership is not only a question of equity, it's also a question of competence. And we have now emerging evidence, done also from low and middle income countries, showing that when women become school leaders, they can do the job very well. And this is a graph that is extracted from a report authored by the WIL team that analyzes the association between learning outcomes at the student level and being in a school run by a woman across 14 Francophone African countries. So what we see here is that in 10 countries, having a woman or a man as a director has no direct influence on learning. This is not to say that the gender of the director is not an important factor, but it is not a statistically significant variable when it comes to explain learning results at the student level. But in 4 countries, which are Benin, Madagascar, Senegal, and Togo, children attending schools led by women have better results. And this result is not coming from contextual factors that are taken into account in the modeling behind this analysis. So when women school leaders are usually more qualified. This is something we see in the data from Sub-Saharan Africa here. They are also more in urban locations. They are also more in private schools. All that is true. But even when this is leveled out, when this is considered in the modeling, there are these 4 countries in the region where women excel. However, what is really, I think, fantastic of this analysis, and others that I will show you afterwards, and also some of the reference that are here in the gray panel, is that it's not that women by default are doing better, right? Women do not always have the opportunities needed to be good school leaders, but when they do, they can make a significant contribution to improving learning outcomes. And the interesting thing for us in this project, in this research we are conducting, is to understand why. What are those things that women's school leaders do different? How these things, practices, I will say, can be institutionalized in countries with policies so that all school principals, regardless of gender, can take their pupils far, that all children could benefit from effective school leadership practices. Next slide, please. So as I promised, we run similar analysis with data from Southeast Asia, and we see similar results in some countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. Regardless of being underrepresented, women school leaders make a positive difference in terms of learning. Next slide. And same is observed in some Latin American countries. 3 countries here stand out: Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Guatemala, and Peru, with students in schools led by women have better results in terms of learning. Here is mathematics, language, and science. Next slide. So we have so far talked about equity, competence, and there is also a third argument that is crucial. Women leaders play a key role in targeting traditional and gendered norms and also adopt distinctive leadership practices. So we have evidence from other research pieces that the team is producing, showing that women school leaders contribute to creating more positive teaching and learning environments. They report higher levels of instructional leadership. They are more inclined to actively encouraging and monitoring teacher attendance. They engage more often with parents, and they also are more likely to organize remediation classes to address students' learning needs. So also there is evidence showing that greater representation of women in the school leadership positions helps to generate model effects, and model effects challenge gendered social norms. What evidence is showing is that exposure to women as role models narrow the gender gap in parents' aspirations for their daughters, in girls' aspirations for themselves, in teachers' aspirations. So this contributes to modify beliefs and attitudes around gender equity and have a really protective effect towards decreasing girls' vulnerability and discrimination to also sexual harassment and abuse. So with this, I give the floor to my colleague Sonakshi to continue the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolina. Great. So Carolina just shared a bit about the global evidence on women leaders and why they're important. And as you saw, they remain underrepresented, but despite the importance of having women in these positions, and when women do overcome the barriers, they're able to perform well. So with this initiative, we're trying to understand how we can address those barriers and why women and what practices women use when they are in leadership positions. So that is Women in Learning Leadership. It's an applied research initiative. As Carolina mentioned, it's a partnership across 3 organizations. And the goal for this initiative is twofold. The first is to promote promising management and leadership practices to improve student learning. And then the next, to have better representation of women in school leadership. And we do this by examining differences in school leadership practices by gender and understanding how this relates to educational performance. We try to identify the barriers that hinder women's access to leadership and their success once they get there, and then to identify how those can be addressed. And then finally, to identify more concrete ways to scale up the best practices and strengthen school leadership more broadly. To do so, we are conducting country-level research, currently across 7 countries in Africa. And this graphic here outlines the 4 main phases of the research, which is mixed methods and characterized by continuous co-creation with ministries of education, as well as other partners who are working on these issues in those different countries. So I'll go through the phases quickly. The first phase is an institutional framework analysis, leveraging existing policies, documents, and conversations with policymakers to understand the environment for school leader recruitment, training, evaluation, and so on. The second phase is an analysis of existing secondary data, and this is primarily the raw school level or student level administrative, we call EMIS or SIEGE data, to characterize the school leadership workforce and differences by gender. The third phase is a primary data collection, both quantitative and qualitative, to now understand what the practices, leadership practices and management practices look like in classrooms and how men and women might be approaching things differently, and to also look at what barriers women are facing more deeply and how we might be able to address them. And then the final phase is bringing all of this information together, and then together with the local stakeholders, identifying policy, system, school level levers that we can use to scale up the good practices that we're learning about. So to make this more salient, I'm going to pass over to my colleagues Nelly and Fanilo, so they can give you an example of one of the countries where the research is active in Madagascar. This next segment will be in French. So just as a heads up for those who might want to change the interpretation settings. Over to you, Nelly and Fanilo.
Merci, Sonakshi. Donc, Madagascar est un des pilotes de l'initiative
We have a pilot here,
on a déjà finalisé les deux.
And we have the professional, which roles of the director or the principal. We are trying to do some collaborations with the Ministry of Education, National Ministry of Education. And since 2024, we are assessing the performance of the leadership at schools, so principals, male and female. And those studies are giving us a baseline analysis. And we see results of the tests of the students for the students to have better participation, to be part of this process. So it puts together all the principles, men and women. In Madagascar, we consider that we have equal representativeness between men and women in the primary years, but in the secondary level, so in high school, it changes. We have more disparity. We have a significant number of women as teachers. And in the private sector, for example, we have 55% of women. And this representativeness, it varies a lot in a very expressive fashion through several districts of Madagascar. So a difference of 81%. So we see those women, they have a very, very strong presence as principals. It benefits a lot, the infrastructure, and it benefits not only the country, not only the region, the district, but the country as a whole. And those regions are occupying about the primary school. The first school years, we have more women than men, and they count on their certificate. They have teaching certificates, teacher training. They are qualified. We have a positive association between growth of boys and girls when a school is led by a woman. There's a significant percentage showing that. So in what refers to the urban environments, we have an influence regarding gender when we talk about chiefs and entrepreneurs. So many chiefs of schools, many women are principals, and when we have equality, we have some better results. And I'll pass the floor to my other colleague. Morning, everyone. We talked about the Ministry of Education and which measures we are taking to work on the assessment, analysis of these aspects. So we've showed that. So we in the Ministry of Education, we've acknowledged that we have a kind of a connection in what regards to women leadership and results throughout the school community. It's those women, they need to be validated, recognized. So recognition, validation, mainly throughout the educational sector. So school learning must be inclusive. More women are necessary because women, they have a kind of this maternity talent that is innate, right? And it applies to education. We are doing scientific assessments, you know, to identify what can be transformed in evidence and replicated. So the guidance for the school establishment, it goes much better when we have a woman principal. So students, they learn better and they pass to the other years, they pass through the school years with better performances. So, and about management, the things are repeated. So learning and administrative skills are better with women. So we need to pay attention to that. And most of all, thinking about learning and leadership. Another important point to highlight, we are trying to facilitate the promotion of schedule, planning, establish of goals, set goals and targets in terms of recruitment. May women be included equally. And we need and we want to state that this is urgent to foster equality between men and women, mainly talking about school leadership and school management and all, and throughout all the educational system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fanilo and Nelly. So we're going to move back into English. And just to say, it was really great that Fanilo and Nelly could join us because they're on the ground implementing, and Fanilo's from the Ministry of Education. So you were hearing from the implementers here on that one. And maybe I wanted to share another quick case study before talking about what some of the emerging recommendations are. And this one is for Chad. We're sharing this because the context here is different from Madagascar. So in Madagascar, you heard that the teaching workforce is more feminized. And in Chad, the situation is very different. In fact, women are severely underrepresented in the teaching workforce in Chad. Only 20% of teachers are women. But despite that, in both countries, we see that school leaders remain, women remain underrepresented as school leaders. Some of the other trends are also similar. In Chad too, we see that this underrepresentation is starker in rural areas. And then we also see that the representation varies across regions and districts. So looking at the map on the right-hand side, the darker blue represents more women and the lighter blue represents less women. And so you see that it really varies depending on where in the country you are. In Chad, we also noted that the process of appointing school leaders was different by school type, different in public schools, in private schools, in community schools. And this kind of difference in selection process also resulted in a strong correlation between the percentage of female teachers and percentage of school leaders in the system. This is perhaps unsurprising. The larger the share of women in the pool of candidates, the higher the likelihood that they are selected as a leader. You can see this correlation on the right-hand side. And then we also saw a positive association between women's school leadership and dropout rates. So there were lower dropout rates for girls. Again, this is controlling, as Carolina was saying previously, for different contextual factors. And despite that, we see that women's leadership may benefit girls staying in school longer. So those kind of are just emerging results from the first two stages. What are some of the policy actions that are emerging from this stage? The research is yet to, the research is still ongoing, and we're still, we're yet to do stage 3 and 4 of the research, like the primary data collection. But already there's many emerging actions. First, taking a step back, we're learning that women, they face multiple intersecting barriers in rising to and thriving in school leadership positions. So here on the left, you see, we use this framework to identify these factors and divide them across 3 levels. At the more macro level, there's structural factors, such as a shortage of candidates to recruit from, absence of standardized and strictly defined criteria to select school leaders, and so on. At the meso level, it's the deeply rooted and harmful stereotypes and traditional norms which continue limiting women's opportunities. And then at the more micro level, which is about the women, they could be constrained by low self-esteem or confidence in their own abilities, part of which is the socialization of kind of the gender norms in the societies where they're based. And then they might also be constrained by time and energy that is linked to balancing household responsibilities and professional responsibilities. So based on this, what are some policy actions to enhance the representation of women in leadership positions? So starting with, we see that establishing a standard recruitment framework for school leaders and professionalizing the school leadership role and training can serve as important ways to make this process of selection more objective, so that subjective bias or subjective criteria don't limit women's opportunities. We also see that strengthening incentives for being based in remote and difficult areas is particularly beneficial for women, and thinking about making these incentives more women-friendly too. Next, implementing mentoring, coaching, peer networking, or learning programs that are specifically designed for female teachers as well as students, both boys and girls, which would then kind of contribute to the future pipeline of school leaders. In some contexts, quotas for women's representation in different levels, so teacher training schools, in school leadership and inspection roles, etc., have been helpful. More broadly, sensitization about these gender issues in the education system and communities for both men and women, boys and girls. And then finally, down the line, what we're hoping to do also with this research is to design and strengthen leadership guidance and trainings to incorporate all of the best practices that emerge. I will stop there with the presentation for the day. Thank you for listening. You can find more resources here on the websites and also contact the team at the contact information on this slide. And maybe I will hand over to Twamanaya so she can organize a bit, and we'd love to hear any questions or reflections from the audience next. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Twamanaya. Working for IIEP-UNESCO Dakar as a research and development specialist. We do not have any questions in the chat yet, but if you have one, please share them with the audience so we can ask our panelists. Maybe to launch the discussion, we could maybe dig into the practices that have been shown as promising in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular in the context of Madagascar, which stands out as one of the few countries in Africa where the representation of women in the school leadership position is important. I do not know who will go first. Maybe Sonakshi, as you just mentioned that in your slides.
Thanks, Twamanaya. So in terms of the practices that we're finding are more promising, leadership and management, there's different things and evidence is coming from different countries, but we're seeing that women might be likelier to promote a positive learning environment through in their classrooms. They may be more likely to engage with teachers to address attendance issues. They're likelier to communicate with parents in the communities about the state of their children's learnings, as well as about remedial classes, etc., for their students. And then we also see that the report to leverage a more instructional style of leadership as well. So this is kind of globally, this is what we see. And then also from the Southeast Asia region, we see that in some countries, they're more likely to focus on higher order tasks, so more high-level organization strategic tasks, instead of things and delegate other lower order tasks so that they're more able to provide guidance to teachers. And then we also see that they're possibly focusing on building positive environments for the students. So this is a little bit of a hodgepodge of what's coming globally, but with Will, we're also aiming to go deeper at the country level and see what comes up. And maybe I'll ask Carolina to also jump in on this.
Thank you, Tamanaya. So this is a question that it's always raised when we present our research, because our objective is to influence practices and policies. So you ask about practices, and that's really important. One thing that we have seen policymakers are actually doing is engaging in building and designing professionalization frameworks, so that the school leadership position in some contexts is quite new. Countries are more used to put a lot of effort in the recruitment and qualification of teachers, and then, well, the teacher who is longer at the school, who has more experience, will by default become the school leader. When now we know that leadership and management implies training, implies efforts, so countries are realizing that there is very important to start building at the national level policies, taking also into account equity dimensions. So what women need to go further in their tasks. This is really important because it's not something that will continue to happen by default if we don't really pay attention to what is happening at the national scope. With that, I will give the floor to Nelly in French, if she can give us a couple of ideas. She is or insights from the research she is conducting on the field in Madagascar. Thank you. Nelly, tu peux prendre la parole. Tu es en mute. Ah. Nelly, it's not working. Okay. You are on mute. Okay. I was just asking Nelly if you can give us some insights from the research in Madagascar about practices or efforts that will help women to better perform as school leaders. Yeah, it's not working, I think. Okay.
Oui.
Thanks, Caroline. In Madagascar, we're trying to implement throughout the Ministry of Education, we're trying to value on school leadership and also value woman as a human being, right? So we are focalizing in the professionalization, building the capacity. So the goal for the Ministry of Education are basically this. We are trying to try out new ways of improving the women's situation in general, and maybe in a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, we'll have a better professionalization among women. In Madagascar, our context is very, very specific. We have a predominance in men teaching. So teachers are mostly men, but we are trying to foster more training for women to be new teachers. And so 47% of teachers are men, right? But when it refers to school leadership, only 35% are women. So the number is lower. So just 1 minute to conclude our session. And would you like to wrap it up? Final remarks? We have a question from the attendees. I'll pass to English, or switch into English now.
Finding in chat that women leaders are more likely in the private sector is interesting. Was there any evidence as to why this might be and what learning there could be for the public sector? That's a very, very good question.
I can take that, Somanaya. Thanks for the question, Marta. So I think there's two main reasons that drives more women in the private sector. One is that they're likelier to be in more urban settings or closer to city centers, and where we kind of see that that means there's better facilities. Women are better able to balance household responsibilities with their homekeeping responsibilities, and if they need to be based with their partners, that's more possible in an urban setting where the jobs are. So one is just that the location of private schools is likelier in Chad to be in more urban settings. The second, and this is something we want to explore more, it potentially could be the way that that school leaders are selected. So in public schools, they are selected by the inspector, the pedagogical inspector at the district level. And there's no kind of standardized eligibility criteria for that selection, but rather kind of recommendation based on their subjective observations. In private schools, the selection often occurs based on committees composed of different types of members across different levels. So potentially what could be happening is perhaps a little bit more of an objective selection process, but this is definitely something that we're hoping to investigate more closely when we go and do the primary data collection.
Thank you, Sonakshi. So we need to conclude, but I want once again to thank the audience very much for joining us, perhaps inviting you to access our publications, both the IIEP website and the UNICEF Innocenti website have all the different publications, the insights we are presenting, and the project is currently entering in an exciting phase of field research and data collection. We are going to be collecting original data on practices, leadership, and gender barriers for school leaders in 4 countries. So we have Benin, Guinea, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. So we will be sharing more results, so stay tuned, and thank you very much for the attention of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. We hope you had a great time learning about how we can advance women's representation in school leadership with these amazing case studies and examples from Madagascar and Chad. Thank you so much, everyone, and to our panelists for sharing these insights, sharing all this data. To continue the conversation in the School Leadership Summit, be sure to join us for our next session, which is the School Leaders Lounge. The link is in the chat. And if you want to learn more about the UNESCO GEM report on school leadership, the link of the report is also in the chat. See you all and have a good evening, good day.